You may have heard that the online retailer Newegg recently scammed the tech YouTuber Gamers Nexus by refusing to refund their money for a return, claiming customer-induced damage. Well, Gamers Nexus said they never even opened the package. Hi, I'm Hauke with PSP Advisor. In the wake of this incident going viral, it feels like everyone is jumping to conclusions, picking their villains, either accusing Gamers Nexus of lying or calling for a boycott of Newegg. But few people seem to wonder what might have gone on for a situation like this to actually come about. So that's what we're going to explore today: defects and returns in supply chains. And maybe we can figure out who should bear the burden along the way. While we may never know for sure what exactly happened here and whether this incident was in fact sketchy or even a scam, it presents a great opportunity to look at what happens when a defect is discovered somewhere in the supply chain. Let's start by demystifying what a supply chain actually is. The pandemic certainly has catapulted this term into the common vernacular. But what actually is a supply chain, and why do we call it that? Well, I, a customer, want to buy something. In economics terms, I have a demand. Someone else is willing to give me what I want, likely in exchange for money. They are supplying the good or service I desire. That is basically what we mean by supply and demand. In reality, when you're purchasing something, it is most likely not from an individual, but rather a store, or more generally, a retailer. You give the retailer money, and in return, they furnish you with a product or service. The retailer on the other side procures their products from a wholesaler or manufacturer, who in turn buys the parts from a vendor in order to make what they sell. Each of those steps looks a little bit like a link in a chain, doesn't it? Hence the term supply chain. Supply chains can be short and simple, like farm to table. The farmer sells directly to an end customer, but he or she does buy seeds from a supplier. And unless you buy the products at the farm, there also is transportation to the market involved. When you add a grocery store in the mix, the supply chain gets a little longer. In fact, supply chains can get quite a bit lengthy. For example, when you buy a computer from the store buys it from a manufacturer, who in turn buys components or sub-assemblies like graphics cards from their suppliers, who in turn procure individual parts. The companies making the parts acquire raw material that in turn has to be mined or produced, and so on. Generally, goods and services tend to flow downstream, while money and information usually flow in the other direction. In reality, supply chains can be much longer, especially when we take transportation into account. They can also get significantly more complex, which can potentially lead to conflicts. The semiconductor industry is an interesting example here. Think of a company manufacturing both computers and components, say hard drives, which they install into their computers, but they also sell to their competitors. But let's explore that another time. Throughout the supply chain, defects can be introduced at any stage. Impurities sneak in during the raw material stage, something isn't wired correctly during parts manufacturing, a pin gets bent during the installation at the manufacturer, or something is dented during transport. The opportunities are endless. And when this happens, it often goes unnoticed. So in order to ensure damaged goods are not passed on to the respective customers, companies usually perform some type of check before shipping the goods on to the next link down the chain. It also is not uncommon to inspect inbound goods for defects upon receiving. We commonly refer to these measures as testing. They may be visual or physical, it may involve all or some items, and it may be ongoing or reactive. Let me know in the comments below if you're interested in going into more depth on that topic in another video. The problem with testing, however, is that it consumes resources, time, salary, equipment, space, while not adding any additional value to the product. It merely helps recover lost value before passing it on to the next link in the chain. At best, it can help uncover a systemic issue. More costly than testing, however, is advancing defects to the next step, or worse, the end customer. Not only does that carry with it a loss of reputation, as seen with Newegg, and with it the potential loss in revenue, but it also likely results in returns. This effectively reverses the flow of the supply chain. Material flows back upstream and is either replaced or some form of monetary compensation, like a refund, occurs. It is easy to see how, as this is the exception to the process, this consumes even more resources than the normal flow would. Additional communication occurs in both directions. Likely an RMA has to be issued before the return can proceed. Parts and products have to be packaged and shipped to the supplier, and likely an investigation to determine who needs to bear the burden has to happen before said replacement or refund is issued by the upstream link. Additionally, depending on where in the supply chain this happens, it might result in a potentially significant and costly delay. All this is a lot of work for essentially nothing, and everyone in the process is unhappy about it. It really is a lose-lose scenario. And of course, how it is handled may very well exacerbate the situation, as seen in this particular instance. Knowing all this too well, it is highly unlikely that vendors, unless they have some kind of monopolistic position and can afford to just not care about their customers, would intentionally do this to systemically scam their customers. The repercussions simply would be too big and they wouldn't stay in business for long. When material is sent back upstream, it is received and inspected by the supplier, similar to the inbound inspection in the manufacturing process. When you are returning something to a vendor, they often ask you why you are returning it. Whether your answer is, I didn't end up needing it, or it doesn't work, will trigger very different reactions by the inbound logistics. If the packaging has never been opened, for example, it may simply receive a visual check for the box's structural integrity, but if it was opened, additional analysis is needed before it can be restocked. And if the packaging has been opened, the part or product can usually not be sold as new anymore. This is where we get the refurbished and open box deals from. The goal for the vendor is to determine if the product needs to A, be removed from circulation, or B, can be restocked and sold to another customer as is, or if C, any issue present needs to be remedied first before the item can go back on the shelf. So the answer to the question, who should bear the burden from earlier, depends quite a bit on the scenario at hand. Let's ignore the thermal paste on socket element of the Newegg case for a moment, and for the sake of argument, go with the bent pin scenario instead. Something that easily could be induced by a customer mishandling the motherboard, but could also happen in several other places in the supply chain. If a packaging was never opened or the damage was discovered by the customer upon opening the box, it is reasonable to assume the defect was induced during manufacturing or at some point in the upstream supply chain, and the customer is off the hook. He or she gets a replacement or refund, but the detective work and the RMA process continues up the supply chain until the source of the damage is found. Unless, of course, the vendor can prove definitively that the product left their facility in working condition and the damage was not induced during transport. This, by the way, is why having a solid QA procedure at the end of your production line, as well as good processes and documentation at the logistics company, are vitally important. So back to the actual situation. Thermal paste doesn't show up on a socket unless somebody is installing a processor. In other words, the customer must have opened the box and used the board. So, case closed. Newegg is right. Right? Not so fast. Knowing that Gamers Nexus did not open the box points to another scenario. The box likely was sold to another customer who opened it and then returned the board to Newegg in the past. Which, by the way, is indeed what happened. Gamers Nexus purchased an open box item. So Newegg should have inspected and found the issue when the box was first returned to them, and remedied it at that point before putting the item back on the shelf for resale. In other words, both parties are right in their statements, but Newegg's return process appears to be broken, resulting in a PR disaster for them that could have been prevented. Let's hope they review and improve their process so something like this doesn't happen again in the future. And maybe this is a good time for you to pressure test your return processes, for example with a mystery shopper program. Let me know in the comments if you want me to talk more about that in another video. For now, thank you for watching, please consider subscribing and give the video a like if it earned it. And I look forward to seeing you again next time.